Hi everyone, and welcome to the sixth lesson in our Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde GCSE revision series. If you're sitting a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde essay this year, this is a really great series for you. We're going through all of the characters, all of the themes, key quotes, model answers and paragraphs to make sure that you do the best you can in this part of the exam. As I said, this is the sixth lesson in our series. In the first 5 lessons, we've covered Utterson, Jekyll, Hyde, Lanyon, as characters, and then we've also done good versus evil as a theme. Today's lesson, we're going to be going through violence as a theme. If you haven't seen any of those previous videos and you're studying this, highly recommend you check those out. Every week, just tons of quotes, tons of information that you need for each part of the exam. Even if you feel like you know the sections well, I would recommend watching it just to get more quotes and just to revise. So let's talk about violence today. So every character in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde on some level has some violence in them. That suggests that there is this sort of innate violence within humanity. I think that's what Stevenson was trying to say. There is more violence, obviously, in Mr. Hyde than any of the other characters. There's no doubt about that, really, is there? But there is subtle violence or overt violence in every single character. So I want to explore more than just Mr. Hyde trampling on the little girl and clubbing Mr. Danvers Carew to death. I want to look at some of the other violence as well, because guess what? If you want to get a level 7, 8, or 9 in your GCSE, what you really want to be doing is going beyond the low-hanging fruit, beyond the more obvious quotes and the more obvious responses to violence, basically. So we'll look at some more subtle violence together, which hopefully will be quite useful because some of it probably you won't have thought about before. We'll go through quotes, like I said, and then we'll do a model paragraph at the end like normal. Other than violence being innate in all the humans, it clearly drives the narrative forwards in this novella as well. Yeah, so without violence in the novel, we wouldn't really have a novel. It's the violence of trampling on the little girl, Mr. Enfield telling Mr. Utterson about Mr. Hyde trampling on the little girl, that starts Mr. Utterson's investigation on Mr. Hyde, that then spurs things forward. It's obviously Mr. Hyde's decision to kill a man, Sir Danvers Carew, that drives the narrative further forwards. And through that action, that also then represses Dr. Jekyll until he can't take it anymore, and he has that final drink of the potion, which tips the balance of good and evil, which we've spoken about in the good and evil theme lesson. And at that point, obviously, Jekyll's lack of control is what continues to drive the narrative forward to the ending. And I don't want to necessarily say the denouement. Denouement is a fancy word for the wrapping up, but almost really the catastrophe at the end. This is more of it's a tragedy and it's a Gothic novella. So it's more of a catastrophe at the end or a tragedy at the end, right? And Dr. Jekyll finishes the novel at the end of a full arc. He's dead, but he's fully corrupted and fully destroyed by his bad choices. But violence is obviously key to all of that. It is a Gothic novella. As I said, the violence in that helps to add to the Gothic, as well as a sense of mystery. Throughout, we sort of wonder why Hyde is the way he is, and we wonder why, where he goes and what's happening to him. And the fact that he's so violent adds to a catalyst to that. The violence can link to Darwinism as well. So you can think about the fact that Darwin proposed that we had evolved from more primitive animals such as apes and primates of other types, who mostly are more aggressive and competitive than we are. So this idea that there's this violence innate within us maybe comes from this idea of evolution. You've also got, I've spoken about this several times on this channel, the Freudian psychology of the id versus the ego versus the superego. So violence can very clearly link to the id particularly. And when the ego loses control of the id, there is violence. It links to potentially addiction in the society. So you could definitely argue that Dr. Jekyll is addicted to violence because he's been so repressed. Mr. Hyde is clearly addicted to violence. I think that there is a lot of sort of moments of anger that could be seen as possibly addiction. We'll talk about Dr. Lanyon in that sense. I think that's quite an interesting one. And then, as I already said, a lot of the violence stems from repression. So Dr. Jekyll only creates Mr. Hyde really because of the fact that he is repressed. Okay, so let's dive into some violence quotes together. There's quite a few that I'd like to go through and explain to you and think about. So we will do a couple of the obvious ones too, obviously, but we will go through some of the less obvious ones that you might not have connected to violence. So then all of a sudden he broke out in a great flame of anger, stamping with his foot, brandishing the cane and carrying on, as the maid described it, like a madman. So you've got several things in here. You've got the metaphor of a flame of anger. Fire is not easy to control. So it suggests that Mr. Hyde's anger and violence is hard to contain or control. You've got brandishing his cane. The word brandishing has like a warlike connotation. You can imagine like brandishing your sword. Well, he's brandishing his cane as a weapon, obviously links to violence. And then the fact that he's described as being like a madman, that simile also adds to the sort of senseless nature of the violence as well. There is a sort of a senseless nature to this violence. By the way, if you're not making notes as you watch this, I encourage you to just take a second, grab a piece of paper, pause the video, grab a piece of paper, get a pen or type this out or something like that. I think that would be useful. The other thing I could do, I suppose, is I could like paste some of these in the description. So if you think that would be useful, comment below. I could start putting the key quotes in the description for you. I might do that anyway. Anyway, so the most racking pangs succeeded, a grinding in the bones, deadly nausea, and a horror of the spirit that cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. So this is describing, obviously, Dr. Jekyll's transformation. Look at the violence in this imagery. We don't necessarily always think of the transformation as being violent in itself. We think of the end of the transformation being violent because obviously the man that is created is violent, but we don't necessarily think of the transformation process. But look at this, racking pangs. A pang is like a pain or an ache. A grinding in the bones, that's got sort of connotations of death, and it's very visceral imagery. Deadly nausea, very unpleasant, violent, horrifying. A pain, a horror that creates a pain and so on that cannot be exceeded at the hour of birth or death. So this is extreme imagery. I don't think it's hyperbole is the scary thing, but look at the violence that the transformation shows in order to become Mr. Hyde. It sort of shows it's unnatural, it shows it's not right. So that's a way that you could look at violence in an unusual way, the violence of the transformation itself, and how that then forebodes the violence of Mr. Hyde, perhaps. Once a woman spoke to him, offering, I think, a box of lights. He smote her in the face, and she fled. I think I spoke about this quote when we were looking at Mr. Hyde as a character study, but smote her in the face for offering him a box of lights. So you've got this weird juxtaposition of her doing a kind gesture and him smoting her in the face. It's a very unusual verb choice as well. It's like, it's got a lot of power and anger and almost judgment in there, which is quite strange. That's another way that you could look at Mr. Hyde and violence in an interesting, unusual way. Mr. Hyde almost casts some judgment on humanity. One of the reasons perhaps he is the way that he is because he's almost judging the kindness of mankind, and he wants to punish the kindness of mankind. And the way you could look at that even deeper is that Sir Danvers Carew is described as being this like really nice old man, like really pleasant guy. And Mr. Hyde can't stand that goodness that he sees in Sir Danvers Carew, so he then kills him. So you could see that part of his violence, part of his anger is actually a judgment on goodness itself, like trying to overwhelm goodness as best as he can. So that's an interesting thought with violence as well. Dr. Lanyon, this is why I said possibly addiction might be in there. So when Mr. Utterson visits Dr. Lanyon is there with his wine, and he's a very red-faced man. So the imagery of him having a red face, generally we think of it more like symbolic, that he's like full of blood and energy and life. But it could be that he's a bit tipsy or a bit drunk, honestly. And in London at the time that this was written, and Edinburgh, which is where Stevenson was from, basically all of the major cities, I would say, there was a lot of alcoholism. There was a lot of addiction to drugs, particularly like opium dens, things like that. At this point, cocaine was a medicinal product. So Stevenson himself, at this point, writing this novella, was most likely under the influence of cocaine because he was dying from tuberculosis. They gave cocaine to people who were suffering and dying as a pain relief and as literally a so-called medicine, right? So when Dr. Lanyon flushes purple and is so angry with Dr. Jekyll for his unscientific balderdash, this is a doctor and a respected doctor. It says that there are crowds of patients at his door. And yet even he within himself has this violent tendency. He's very angry and violent. You get the sense that if Dr. Jekyll was there right now, he would shout at Dr. Jekyll. He would maybe even physically want to fight Dr. Jekyll. So we see this anger even in so-called good characters in the novella. I'm actually going to skip to a different quote quickly because I want to highlight this interesting thought that doctors can be violent, right? So Dr. Jekyll clearly has violent tendencies because he invents Mr. Hyde and creates him to get to do horrible things to people. Dr. Lanyon has a streak of violence in him. We see that in the quote I just showed you. Then you've got this sort of like mini extract, I suppose. There's several violences I want to talk about, but so let's just read it and then I'll talk about the doctoral violence. So the people who had turned out were the girl's own family. Pretty soon, the doctor for whom she had been sent put in his appearance. Well, the child was not much the worst, more frightened, according to the Sawbones. And there you might have supposed would be an end to it. But there was one curious circumstance. I had taken a loathing to my gentleman at first sight. So Utterson feels a sense of hatred and violence towards Mr. No, I'm sorry, this is Mr. Enfield, I'm sorry. Mr. Enfield feels a certain loathing and violence towards Mr. Hyde straight away. So had the child's family. Well, you know, of course the child's family would feel some anger and violence towards the person who just trampled on their daughter, I guess, which was only natural. Yeah. So this is, I suppose you could say, justified violence, because some of the violence in the novella is justified. But the doctor's case was what struck me. He was the usual cut and dry apothecary of no particular age and colour, with a strong Edinburgh accent and about as emotional as a bagpipe. So that's an interesting little metaphor, or simile, sorry, as emotional as a bagpipe. So basically the doctor doesn't seem like he would have much emotion in him. And yet, like the rest of us, every time he looked at my prisoner, I saw that Sawbones is a doctor, turn sick and white with desire to kill him. So do you see that? There's violence here in the doctors. That's a very unusual thing. Most students don't comment on that, but that's a really interesting thing to talk about. The violence in the doctors. Dr. Jekyll, obviously, Dr. Lanyon, and also this doctor who comes to assist the girl that was trampled on in chapter 1. So there's a really interesting thing there, I think. Right in the middle, there lay the body of a man sorely contorted and still twitching. So you've got violent, visceral imagery of the death of Mr. Hyde. So this does create a little bit of a denouement. Like I said, I think that the novel ultimately ends in catastrophe, really, because Jekyll dies from his discovery and not his addiction to it. But you've got this violent sort of suffering image of Mr. Hyde at his end. He's sort of there laying and twitching. It's pretty messed up image, actually, very gothic. Whatever he'd done, Hyde would pass away like the stain of breath upon a mirror, and there in his stead, quietly at home, trimming the midnight lamp in his study, a man who could afford to laugh at suspicion would be Henry Jekyll. So there's also the link between violence and deception, right? So Dr. Jekyll knows that what Mr. Hyde is doing is violent and evil and wrong, and yet he will just ignore that. He says that Hyde is like a stain of breath upon the mirror. So, you know, if you breathe on a mirror, very quickly you can just wipe away the condensation and it's all done, right? So Jekyll, as a doctor, as a Victorian gentleman, the violence really sours his character. We like him less because he knows that what he's doing is creating violence, but he takes no responsibility for it. And he actually almost sort of enjoys the fact he can get away with it, at least when Hyde is doing smaller crimes like smacking people around and trampling on them, he does have a change of heart when the violence amplifies up to killing Sir Danvers Carew. But even that, he's so addicted to Hyde, he can't escape it. All right, final one. There's also a lot of violence in the setting. So violence in the setting, the door, which was equipped with neither bell nor knocker, was blistered and stained, sort of a disdain, sorry, imagery of suffering on the door front, sort of this idea that there's lots of suffering in London and violence in London, even to the setting of London. Tramps slouched into the recess and struck matches on the panels. So you got like violence through arson in a sense, minor arson, like burning things. Children kept shop upon the steps. The schoolboy had tried his knife on the mouldings. So you get this idea that the children are being raised into a violent setting here. And for close on a generation, no one had appeared to drive away these random visitors or to repair their ravages. So no one seems to be doing anything about the violence either. So that's one of the saddest things about the novella that no one really thinks about is, and this is why I think it ends in catastrophe, not denouement, not wrapping up. So Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde die, right? But that's not the end of it. There's still all this violence in London that has been shown. It's also, I didn't get a quote for this, I maybe should have put one in, but there's some violent imagery in the way that the weather is described as well, the darkness of the clouds and the shadows and all that sort of stuff. So violence permeates this entire novella. It's to summarize, I suppose, what I'm talking about here before we write a model paragraph. Violence is in the setting, it's in the Victorian gentleman and doctors, everyone really, yeah, not just Mr. Hyde. Violence is linked to repression and deception, particularly in Hyde, in Jekyll, who is Hyde. And you see violence in unexpected places as well. Violence in the deaths, obviously, violence in the crimes, obviously. But as I said, violence even in the characters that you don't expect subtly is there. So yeah, let's do a model paragraph together to wrap this up. I hope that was fairly helpful so far. But model paragraph. So we're going to do violence is in unexpected places. One of the most significant aspects of violence in the novella is the way that it is used in unexpected ways for a Victorian text. For instance, even the quote-unquote good characters display moments of anger and violence. Dr. Lanyon, when talking about Mr. Hyde, Dr. Jekyll, blushes suddenly purple. Now, what you can do, if you pick a quote, but you need to sort of change the tense of the quote to make it fit, you can put that word that you need to change into square brackets just to show the examiner that it is still a quote, but that you've slightly modified it. So flushes suddenly purple. And the imagery of this, along with the symbolism of color purple, indicates to us that in this moment, Lanyon is furiously angry at Jekyll and likely would have a physical or verbal fight with him. As doctors, they had agreed to a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, and yet earlier in the novella, we also see the sawbones turn sick and white with a desire to kill him. And wait a minute. Oh yeah, we can just put that word that. Again, displaying the violence of even those in society intended to heal. Do no harm. Now, I'm not sure why Hippocratic Oath is coming up as a little, oh, that's why, because I spelled it wrong. My bad. Or maybe, I think in English spelling, like British English, I think it is Hyppo, but I might be wrong. Anyway, small thing. The Hippocratic Oath is an oath that doctors take to say that they will do no harm in their practice of being doctors. So it's a cool little context thing to add in. So let's go into the significance. As the reader, we feel that Stevenson is suggesting that violence permeates mankind, whether we like it or not. This is significant and interesting. Let's just put interesting when we consider Freud's work on the id, ego and superego, that seem to suggest that there is a primitive part to all people that has a tendency in their worst moments to violence. I think I'll go a little bit deeper than that as well, just to really finish this up. So it is one thing to point the finger at Mr. Hyde. It is another to accept the evil within ourselves. I've just finished that up. Sorry, I think my camera froze briefly there, so apologies for that. But that is a nice little paragraph on violence. So hopefully that gives you some ideas of how you would write about violence. If you have any questions, please comment below. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. Yeah, I think that's everything for today. So I'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much.